Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. This week's parsha is Chaye Sarah. In the only parsha named after a woman, we continue our exploration of issues raised by Israel at war. In the Jewish state, Jewish law, Halacha, has exclusive jurisdiction over marriage and divorce. One area where Orthodox women have radically broken with rabbinic authority is with regard to divorce. Traditionally, women have been at the mercy of the patriarchy, whether their husbands or the rabbinic courts. These women, the NGOs and Rabbis who support them, have used biblical and rabbinic texts to claim rights long denied. The primary source relates to King David and a single verse in the book of Samuel protecting military wives. So join us as we explore these initiatives and texts. Women wage war. Well, welcome. And recently, in the last few days, we celebrated is the wrong word. We marked 30 days since this terrible tragedy occurred. And I wished that as in the mourning of a person who has passed, 30 days meant a milestone towards closure. But there is no closure. This war continues. And we continue discussing the parshiot through the lens of the war that is going on. So, Rabbi, am I correct in saying that this is the only parsha named after a woman?
I think that is correct. Right, and it's ironic because it's named after the life of a woman, but actually it talks about her death. So it's an ironic name.
Well, absolutely. So I'm glad my chief fact checker has borne me out on this because I wasn't 100% sure because it really struck me as, wow, is that the case? So in Genesis 23, it says, Vayehi chaye Sarah mea shana ve'esrim shana, and the life of Sarah was 120 years. Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, now called Hebron. We could say that today, by the way, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham proceeded to mourn for Sarah and to bewail her. And Rashi says the narrative of the death of Sarah follows immediately on that of the binding of Isaac, because through the announcement of the binding, that her son had been made ready for sacrifice and had almost been sacrificed, shenizdamen bana leshchita, she received a great shock. Literally, her soul flew from her. So it's interesting that, at least according to this Rashi, which is based on Pirkei de Rav Eliezer, the death of Sarah was linked to a tragedy. It was linked to a tragedy of the key men in her life, her husband and her son. And that, to me, really emphasized maybe the role of women so much in the Torah, starting with Eve, which is they seem to be the primary victim, but they also seem to be the primary agent for change. And that is the theme that we will explore today. In the Haftorah, which we don't normally mention, but I'm going to read the Haftorah on Shabbat, so I had to look at it.
That's funny. Yeah, okay. It's a good Haftorah.
It's a good Haftorah, and it involves King David. And King David is going to be a part of tonight's discussion. So King David is, while not maybe on his deathbed, he's close to it. And he has a son, like kings all over the world. He has many sons. And there's a son named Admonijah who is giving sacrifices, acting as though he is the heir to the throne. And so Bathsheba, his wife, his first wife, or one of his first wife, comes to him and says, you had promised that Shlomo, Solomon, would succeed you. And you need to stand up and do something. And she ends by saying, otherwise, when my lord the king rests with his ancestors, my son Solomon and I will be regarded as traitors. Ani uveni Shlomo chataim. Chataim is not so much traitors as it is sinners. So
right.
Here we have two women, both in the parsha and in the Haftorah, who are agents of major change, because if Solomon had not been the king, who knows what would have happened. And certainly Sarah is a pivotal protagonist in the story, like all the women in Genesis are. The decisions that she makes have impact for generations. So both of these women, as I said before, are kind of victims, but also the primary agents of change. Does that strike you as well?
That does strike me. I mean, women in the book of Genesis are agents of change. It's interesting, in the rest of the Torah, women play a less important role. But you point out correctly that when we get to the prophets, all of a sudden women play a more prominent role. So it's just interesting in terms of the Torah. They're not always agents of change, but in the two examples you gave, those are great examples of where women are agents of change.
Absolutely.
And sometimes they're troublemakers, like Hagar, like Hagar is a troublemaker. Sometimes they're agents of change by being disruptors.
Which certainly strikes a chord on Madlik, where we study disruptive Torah.
But isn't that right? Hagar is a disruptor.
Well, and what about Eve? Eve is certainly a disruptor.
Yeah, Eve is a disruptor. Esav is a disruptor. Means there are so many people here who are disruptors.
Absolutely. So there are source sheets related that I have posted here and in the podcast. What I want to do is fast forward to my situation during this war, where I am constantly exposed to different people, charities, institutions that in their own way are addressing the needs of this war. And there is one group called Mavoy Satum, which means a closed street, a dead end.
Yeah, correct.
And it is a group primarily run by Orthodox women in Israel that is one of a number of similar amutot, similar not-for-profits, who have taken upon themselves the issue of exactly what we're talking about, which is the right of a woman, even given the stringencies and the ancient parameters of the Halacha that require that a man initiate a divorce. They are arguing that a woman should never have to depend on a man to leave an unsuccessful marriage, or in this case, a marriage where the husband is unable to initiate a divorce, whether because he has died in warfare and his body cannot be identified, or he has sustained wounds that don't permit him the mental facility to grant a divorce. These are women who are fighting, and it's key that they're Orthodox women that are fighting within the law to make sure that no woman is an agunah. The word agunah means an anchor, that a woman is artificially tied, anchored in a place, loses her ability to remarry and in general to have her control over her life. And so I got very early in the war, I'm getting different emails and prospectuses from different charities saying how they were affected. They might be in the area that was affected by the attack. They might be involved with trauma relief and therefore have particular credentials to be able to provide help at this point. So here is this organization that normally fights agunot, women that are anchored, and it comes and says that there is an initiative to make sure that every soldier has been able to sign a divorce in, and we'll get into the exact mechanics of it, but a way to ensure that his wife will never be in the situation of the aguna. And the second I got it, Rabbi, if you recall, I forwarded it to you, and I was just so struck because there's so much that happens in wartime. There's so much happens in crisis where there are unintended consequences. And this is certainly one. So the real interesting thing is that the source for any rules that have to do with breaking this Gordian knot of the aguna, of the woman who is at the mercy of her husband, whether he's a rascal or whether he's unidentified and lost, comes from 1 Samuel, the same David that was featured in our Haftorah. It's in 1 Samuel 17:18, and it talks about what David did before he sent his troops to war. And he talks about sending cheeses to the captain of their 1,000, find out how your brothers are, and bring some token for them. V'et aruvatam tikach. And the word aruvatam, if it reminds you of the word eruv, which is something that connects us all, you are not off the mark. And the Talmud in Shabbat 56 and also in Ketubot learns from here. Rav Shmuel Bar Nachmani said, Rabbi Yochanan said, anyone who goes to a war waged by the royal house of David writes a conditional bill of divorce to his wife. That was done to prevent a situation in which the soldier's wife would be unable to remarry because the soldier did not return from battle and there were no witnesses to his fate. The conditional bill of divorce accorded her the status of a divorcee and freed her to remarry. As it is stated, and carry these 10 cheeses to the captain. So what is the meaning of arubatam? Rabbi Yosef taught it refers to matters that are shared between him, the husband, and the wife. So it relates it. So we've seen many cases such as this where a innocuous verse is used to build a mound out of a molehill, if you will. But in this case, it's either a rabbinic imagination or there was a long-term tradition that this was the case. But nonetheless, there was this sensitivity that was transmitted where there was a sensitivity to working out the mechanics of how a woman could be able to live her life, continue with her life, have her autonomy, even under such extenuating circumstances. And it's an amazing piece of Talmud, but I understand that you are teaching a course right now at your Yeshiva Maharat, and this is actually the subject that you're dealing with.
This is actually the subject I'm dealing with. I have a student in my class. My class is given virtually on Zoom. I have a student from Israel. Her husband is in the army. He's in Gaza. Actually, no, he's not. He's in the north, but he's in the army. And he wrote this document for his wife before he went into the army. He wrote a document which basically says that everything should be well, but if I don't come back from the army, you're allowed to remarry. So this is happening as we speak in Israel right now.
And if you could just share with us, what are the mechanics? Because obviously we can say it's based on this innocuous verse. It's based on the rabbi's interpretation of that verse. But what are the various mechanics and ways that the rabbis have created ways for to solve this situation, so to speak?
So I'm looking at the document right now. It's called a shtar bitachon, which means, it's a guarantee. It protects you. And what it says is that I give permission if I do not return for the chief rabbinate of Israel to write a get to my wife. So, and that, according to the Talmud that I'm studying in Maharat, that is a mechanism that is permissible. Means you can assign somebody to write a get, and they'll write it in the future. So he's assigning the chief rabbinate to write a get if he doesn't come back. Because the problem is, if he doesn't come back, but there's no proof that he's dead, she can't remarry. But if he doesn't come back and then they write a get to her, then she can remarry.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but basically that's one variation. I think the traditional explanation of what happened in David's time was
not that. Was they actually wrote a get.
So you would write a get, you would give it to your friend, and you would say, if I don't return, you give this
deliver it.
You deliver it.
Right.
And so that's another variation. The variation that you're talking about is kind of the power of Bet Din, the power of the court to create something, come down and declare something through the power of the court. But I think the point is that there is an issue. It's an issue that is created by the legal halacha structure. And the rabbis who have decided to, whether in the Talmud, whether in if it happened in the time of David and up till today, there are rabbis who have taken the position that this can't be, and that somehow we have to solve this problem. And that becomes kind of something that's fascinating, I think, because we're dealing, as I said in the intro, we're kind of like in a sonnet, and you have to follow the rules of the sonnet, but at a certain point, you have to overrule the rules and find a way within the law to change the law.
That's correct. I mean, that's right. There, it's interesting. It's what we talked about before about the question of embracing. But what we have here is working within the system, not changing the system, but working within the system.
So it actually is, we're talking about the same thing.
Right. It's a different way of using the system, right? Well, the question is, do you not need a get? Or do you set up a way in which a get will be delivered?
So you shared with me, when I told you what the subject of tonight was, you shared with me an amazing article. It sounds like it's almost an address that Rabbi
it was a speech he gave at a conference.
It was a speech he gave at the conference. The target of the speech was a certain Rabbi Emanuel Rackman, who happened to be the rabbi who bar mitzvahed me. Okay. So, I have to always disclose my bias. And by the way, when I became very religious, my parents said, well, you better talk to our rabbi. And I went to Rabbi Rackman and I said, I'm planning to go to a yeshiva in Brooklyn called Torah Vadas. And he told me, don't do it.
I didn't know that. That's funny.
In retrospect, I understood where he was coming from. Now, in the yeshiva, the way they referred to Rabbi Rackman is Rabbi Rakeman. Rake means empty. He was an
funny.
empty man. So here was a man who I think I can safely say he wrote a book called One Man's Judaism. He was a maverick, and he was very learned, especially for a pulpit rabbi. He was very learned in Halacha. I think he had a legal degree as well. And he took positions that drew fire. And in this particular case, he had a position in the U.S. About women being able to use this, whether it was getting married with a particular type of ketubah that was kedushin al tanai, that was contingent, that if this works out, it's a good marriage. If it doesn't, it must have been a mistake from the beginning. But Rabbi Soloveitchik, if you look at the notes in Sefirah, where I've quoted it, there is vitriol there.
There really is, right?
Threat.
He's cynical towards it, which is not very rabbinic.
He's very cynical, and what he implies is twofold. The main, I think, gist of his argument is that you can't argue with math. You can't argue with geometry. You can't argue with our tradition. If we start picking and choosing, if we start modulating our tradition, all is lost. And I would argue that Rav Soloveitchik in this particular aspect was totally dated. He was looking at the Orthodox Judaism against the Enlightenment, the Orthodox Judaism against reform, against assimilation. It was a fortress mentality. And I think the reason that we have seen a cataclysmic change is something happened that Rav Soloveitchik could never have envisioned. And that is that Orthodox, dedicated, committed women and their supporters amongst the rabbis have argued for this within the tradition. And his whole, and he comes from a time, he comes from a period, as I said, he's dated. He saw this as a defense mechanism. This was, the holding the firewalls, so to speak. But there's been a paradigm shift, would you not say?
There is no question, and it's so interesting you say that, because what I try to explain to my class in Maharat was, why he was dated. And I try to explain to them that Rabbi Soloveitchik was born in Lithuania in 1903. There still was that feeling of a kind of a fight against reform, a fight against, the Enlightenment. That still was very much in existence. When he wrote this in 1975, that was dated. But his tradition was that. So that he was a transitional character from Eastern Europe to America. The students in my class don't know anybody like that anymore.
So I think it is not incidental. It's not by chance that the basis for all of the wiggle room that we have with regard to divorce and marriage comes from the verses that relate to David and war. Because ultimately, what Rav Soloveitchik, I believe, and who am I to criticize Rav Soloveitchik? But I think what he missed was two things. As I said before, it was internal, coming from dedicated, committed Jewish women, but it was also the state of Israel. Where the first fissure happened was in a tragic situation where a submarine was purchased, I believe, from France, and the sailors were bringing the Dakar, which was the name of the submarine, back to Israel. And all of a sudden it disappeared. And as I said at the beginning, one of the ways that a woman can be trapped in a marriage doesn't always mean that they are trapped in a marriage with a rascal, with someone who is a terrible person that won't give them a divorce. It could also just as well be in a situation where, God forbid, a sailor is in a submarine and it sinks and there's no evidence. There's no primary evidence of his death. And in this particular case, the chief rabbi of the army, Rabbi Goren, wrote a teshuvah that was more, I understand, like a book than it was like a responsa. And there's an article that I quote in the notes that kind of gets into the head of Rabbi Goren. And one of the things it says is there was actually a disagreement between Rabbi Goren and the grandfather of the present president of Israel, Bougie Herzog. Isaac Herzog had argued that when the state was started, every soldier should sign the ketubah that Mavai Satum, that you mentioned before, is trying now to have soldiers sign. And the argument against it was it would be bad for morale. What kind of a soldier goes off to war and signs a divorce document if he doesn't come back? And Rabbi Goren was against Rabbi Herzog and diffused that. And the article that I quote from the Jewish press, you can take it or leave it, argues that in retrospect, when it came to the Dakar, he was making amends. But in any case, he created a very legal, radical explanation of how, in fact, the halacha has to be used to say what I always say, to say yes and not to say no. It has to be used to create a way for these women to be able to move on with their life. And that was the beginning of it. But the truth is, the real change happened when Orthodox women took it upon themselves. And I mentioned in the intro, I used the word patrimony, which of course carries a lot of baggage with it. It's a progressive term. It can be overused. But ultimately, whether it's the Emanuel Rachman Center at Bar-Ilan University, or it's an institution created at Or Torah by Rabbi Riskin's yeshiva, it created learned women that were advocates for women. And it understood that the issue here was not only the halacha, but it was also the male-driven bet din, judicial court system of the Rabbanut, who would knee-jerk reaction side with the husband. And this is the pivotal change, the paradigm shift that has occurred in Israel. And what it does is it brings us back to the way we started, which is that women have always served as not only being the primary victim of certain laws, but also the agents of change. And I think that the women who are involved with Mavoi Satum and Or Torah and the Bar-Ilan and the many organizations that are creating advocates and ways of dealing with the court system are really changing the face of Judaism. It's bigger. It's bigger than just agunot. And you, Rabbi, teach at Maharat, which is a yeshiva that gives women a smicha, ordination. You are at ground zero. You understand what this is all about as we celebrate women in this parsha.
This was a great topic, and I think this was the right celebration. I think you're right. In today, right, in these difficult times, celebration means that we see how people, use the halacha to approach real life situations, and that's what people are doing in every single aspect of their life in Israel. And it's really remarkable to see what Mavoy Satum is doing for these women as well. Thank you so much, Geoffrey. This was an amazing topic. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. What we say is that we hope that next week we'll have better news for everybody, but we will be back to study Parshat Toldot next week. Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom. I look forward to studying a parsha not through the lens of war. Please God, the war should be over and we should have peace. But until we do, we will continue to look at our Torah through a new lens. Shabbat Shalom to all of you. Let us have peace. Let us listen to the women in our lives, the feminine inside of us, and let us persevere. Shabbat Shalom.